Okay, I think we're all set now. Dear Maria Garay, dear Secretary General Pingaron, dear rectors, colleagues from universities, from ministries, national university associations, students, researchers, it's fantastic to have a full house here at this university. It's a great pleasure that we have, for the first time, the EUA Funding Forum at a private university. So that also, I think, shows that we're also taking account of this membership. And it's a great pleasure that I can present to you now some trends, and we will do this, as our president already indicated to you, in a slightly different way. We're trying to move away a little bit from very traditional presentations to much more interaction. And I'm very happy that we can do this here in Barcelona. We will also have the opportunity to see a little bit of the city, I think, later at dinner and being here at the campus. Now, we want to do things more interactively. First of all, this session will also be live streamed, so also would like to welcome those who are watching us on live stream. You can also look later on our EUA YouTube channel, what we're discussing here, and I think that's also already part of some of the interaction we're trying to achieve here. I will show you some slides, but we thought we're doing this in a little different way, and also taking advantage that we have with us a professional moderator who is moderating the next session, the leadership panel, Susanne Barta from Italy. And I would like to invite her to join me here on this table. So we thought, well, we're not going to do just showing you trends through slides. You will get more information also via email, so you will have all the information. But we will do a little exchange with Susanne. Susanne is moderator, coach, journalist based in Italy. She's been moderating many events that are also related to our topics, innovation, research, but also covering other topics, culture, democracy, society. And she has a very fascinating series on the South Tyrol radio station, where she invites I would say very charismatic personalities, and engaging them in a fantastic discussion. So I really recommend to you to look that up. I think it's also available on a podcast. So I really love listening to it.
It's in German, though.
Well, it's in German now. That's right. So it's great to have you here, Susanne.
Thank you very much, Thomas. It's a pleasure for me being here with all of you. So what will happen here in the next hour? Thomas already said he's presenting an overview of funding trends in Europe. We will have a conversation about them, and at the end there also will be some time to take your questions. So I think let's get started.
Great. Well, the first trend that I want to present to you is actually a preview of our public funding observatory, which we're going to publish in the end of 2018. So you're the first ones to see that here. We thought we were going to have those who made it to come to Barcelona give you already a look at what we have collected with my colleagues, and in particularly with our members, the National University Associations. Many of you are here, so great thanks to giving us all the data. And what you can see here on this slide is the long-term trend of investment from 2008 to 2017. So you see different color codings. In green, you see those systems that have invested over that period into the higher education systems. The different shadings of green show the different degrees of investment. Then you have those who go into let's say the reddish color, so orange is already where systems have reduced funding, and the red ones that have reduced quite drastically over that period. But what we can see if we look at this trend, and if you have followed our last reports, I think we can say this time investment in universities is improving, but on the other hand, it's not improving fast enough as it should be.
Thomas, already in your last study, you mentioned this study was done 2017, or it was published then, that many countries in Europe have failed to repair cuts made to higher education since the financial crisis, despite experiencing economic recovery. So economic growth is back in Europe, isn't it? Isn't there a catch-up effect?
That's right. It's indeed that we've seen already within the last couple of years in many systems in Europe a positive development. Economic growth is indeed back, but this economic growth doesn't follow the investment patterns. So we did see some progression, and indeed if we look at the last year investment, there are only 4 systems that have reduced funding. All others have invested, but they could have invested earlier or could have invested more. So there is a slightly contradiction between the importance of saying, well, a university system is important, and what you could actually do.
Does it need a drastic call for more investment, do you think?
Certainly, I think that is also what we're trying to do, also trying to provide why it is important to invest in higher education and research and innovation. We will have several sessions here as well that look into how to communicate the importance of investment in universities, why is it good for, because it won't just do to say we need more money, we need to really explain what it is good for. So we will have, I think, excellent sessions to show how some really do that.
What about student numbers? Student numbers are a key factor in long-term funding, aren't they?
Yeah, that's right. If you only look at the investment alone, it only gives you one part of the picture if a system is well funded or not. So that's why we've tried to also categorize systems by combining those 2 data sets. So you have here on this slide the investment. So you have on the horizontal axis, you have an increase in funding or a decrease, and on the vertical, and on the horizontal, you have the student numbers. So towards the right, systems that have a growth in student numbers, towards the left, who have a decline in student numbers. And if you put those 2 data sets together, you can have, well, what we're trying to do, a simplified categorization, but it gives you a sort of already an indication of what the trends are in the different systems. So you have, for example, the front runner box, where we have Norway and Sweden. Those 2 systems have been regularly in this category. That means they have invested more than the growth in student numbers. Portugal is a newcomer to that box, but I want to show you that it's also important to look more closely, because Portugal is not really the same as Sweden and Norway. You can see here that Portugal had a huge dip in 2011 and 2012, and then several countries, several years, and it took them quite a long time to catch up. So although they have now invested more than student growth over that period, still a long time that they need to catch up. We then have the other box of those what we call systems under pressure. They do have invested more, and this is actually the largest box that we have, but student growth has been even higher than the investment growth. As an example, show you here Austria. Austria, you can see a steady growth in investment. So if you only look at that, you would say fantastic. And Austria has indeed been in the past year in the front runner box, but because student growth has been higher this time than the investment, you see that they feature in this box. Maybe one last example for those what we call systems under pressure, those who have, despite a growth in student numbers, a reduction in investment. So those are really the ones in a very challenging box. And here we have Ireland as a case. You can see a continuous decline in funding, only now trying to catch up. And we will also hear from some colleagues in Ireland. They have recently made a strong campaign for investment, and they will tell us more about how they do in that system.
We are here today in a private university, but on average, almost 3/4 of university funding sources. Does it need more diverse income sources?
Well, this is something that we've also tried to promote for a very long time, to find a diversified income for an institutions, because if you depend only very heavily on one source, then there is of course the risk if something happens to that source that you're in trouble. Yeah? So I remember when we discussed 10 years ago those systems who had solid public funding, they said, well, for us this is the best funding source. Well, you could see even in some of these systems they think now differently about that. So we will also address in several sessions what's the right way, how do you find the right balance. So I think that will be an interesting discussion that we have over the next 2 days.
What about the next trend?
Yes, the next trend. The next trend deals a lot with one of the main topics of this conference. One of our projects that we've been running for 2 years is dealing with efficiency, effectiveness, value for money, and those terms have become, in a way, the new mantra for higher education in many, many systems. We see that in the project that we've been running, then in many, many systems, those words come up in the discussions, and you see here on the slide a word cloud where we've asked people what they understand of those terms: efficiency, effectiveness. What does it mean for them? And you can see many, many different things, but resources is one of the words that's very strongly connected. So it has to do with the use of resources in a strong way.
The new public management approach is designed to restructure universities like the private sector to maximize output in university research and teaching. So what do efficiency and effectiveness mean in the university context?
Yeah. Well, I think our president has already in the introduction given a very good definition. I think you have, of course, economic definitions, etc. But I think that really pinned it down. It's about, on the one hand, about the use of resources, but very much we want to look at what you achieve with it. Yeah, do you achieve the aims? So there's a whole discussion around quality about that. We want to move it away from an understanding that efficiency is only using less resources in a limited environment. It really we need to shift it to quality and reaching the main aims in the best possible way.
Can a bad economic situation be a driver for efficiency strategies?
It can be a driver, and it has been a driver in many systems. So the data collection that we've done shows that indeed the situation that I've shown you before on the map has been an important driver for institutions looking at efficiency and effectiveness. But we have to say that in several systems, there has been also top-down approaches to that. We had hiring freezes, cuts to salaries. I mean, also Spain, the country that we're here, that had to deal with that. And then in the long term, that is not necessarily a positive effect. So yes, it has been a driver, but it has also negative effects.
Do you think we should question this mantra?
We certainly have to question some of the tools that are used. So, of course, an economic situation where you can't fund, you have to deal with it. But as we already said just previously, the economic situation is not always an excuse that you couldn't invest properly. So what we think is you should also provide some incentives, for example. So we've seen in some systems that provide what they call sometimes innovation funds to provide incentives for institutions to look indeed into efficiency, effectiveness, but in a more strategic way. So not under pressure, but to use positive incentives to do something with that.
Any more recommendations for policymakers and institutions?
Well, I think for policymakers is really the importance to look at long-term trends, yeah? Because a cut towards a university system is very difficult to catch up, and in a very competitive environment, you need to keep the people that make universities, the academic community, researchers, they need to be fostered in an environment that is well funded. For institutions, it is certainly important to communicate that you're using your resources in an efficient and an effective way. So we see a very strong role about the institutional leadership as well to take this on board, to convince the community that in the end that the use of resources in the best possible way.
Your microphone, I think, is touching here.
Is
better.
Yeah.
Okay.
So the use of resources is necessary also to achieve the main missions of the universities in the best possible way. And we've seen one element that's extremely important is communication. So we also have several sessions on communication around that, where we will address this.
Let's go on. What about trend number 3 on funding reforms?
Yes, trend number 3 on funding reforms. You can see we have huge expectations on funding reforms. That's why we've chosen a little bit that
nice.
kind too.
Didn't see this before. That's very nice.
Yeah, and it's a little bit like that. You have really high expectations. You do funding reform. You use some tools, and that miraculously you will have high impact. You will move universities to do so much more with less. And this is particularly the case for performance-based funding. This is a little bit the other mantra in higher education, performance-based funding, very high expectations. You can see this, the renewed agenda from the European Commission has addressed as one of the 4 important elements, performance-based funding. The OECD is doing work on that. There will be in a couple of weeks, there will be a peer learning event organized by the European Commission. My colleague Nora will be attending that one. And you can see this is discussed everywhere. And we have also done a lot of work around that, but we have to say, well, you have to be cautious with that, and yeah.
Talking about high expectations, do you think we get a more efficient landscape as a result of these evolutions?
It really depends. I think the important part is to first also think about the aims of what you want to achieve and not just jump immediately to a tool like say, okay, performance-based funding is good for you, so we use it. So you really need to think very strongly what do you want to achieve with performance-based funding. Well, you have basically two ways of using performance-based funding. So here on this slide you can see this is a categorization from our a previous project. You have on the one hand indicator funding using output-based indicators, so like the number of students you produce, the number of research publications you have. And the second element is performance contracts, where a university engages into a contract with a ministry or a higher education authority, and they agree on certain activities. So this here shows you basically the two ways of using that. And you have to use it in the right way. So that's one of our recommendations as well. Reduce the expectations on the one hand and use the tools in the right way.
And I think it also needs to define performance in the university context.
That is indeed one of the challenges. You can only use certain proxies to define performance. As I said, you use numbers. You use the numbers of students that you produce, but what does it say about the quality? We have the discussions, of course, about the proxies for research publications, or the amount of research funding that you achieve. But here we really have challenges as soon as it gets into quality, and there are lots of discussions about the quality of teaching, the skills that people have. So they have their limits. Using indicators has its limits. And of course, if you use performance contracts, for example, if you use them in an intelligent way, that can look much more at quality as well. So in a performance contract, you could, for example, if a public authority would like to reduce the dropout rates of students, you could agree with an institution to say, well, you could engage into activities that improve student success, so you can have more support for students, etc. So this is actually something that can be very, very useful.
So we go on to trend 4. What about European funding?
Right, European funding, this is something is discussed in Brussels and in the capitals, have been discussed for the last years, because we're now just ahead of the new funding programs that will be put in place from 2020 till for the next 7 years. So there are discussions about where does the funding go to, and what it looks like, in particular the proposals at the moment for research, the next research funding programs will not meet the demands, nor will they be much simpler. So we've been doing a lot of work on that. We've done lots of campaigns, so you can see here some of our argumentations that we're trying to bring into debate to make the case why it is so important to invest also at European level in higher education and research, and at the same time that is so important to make these programs more efficient in a way. And the whole question of how simple or complex are they is very much connected to efficiency and effectiveness.
But why doesn't EU funding get simpler? Good question. Simple question.
That is indeed a very, very difficult question to answer. Well, we've tried to provide some explanations. First of all, it is very complex to allocate funding at a European level with so many different systems. So in a way, it is impossible that this is going to be a very, very simple program. But at the same time, we have several tensions. So there is the tension between, for example, financial sustainability and simplification. Currently, the European Commission is trying to promote the sort of lump sum funding. That means you will get a certain amount of funding, and with that you do your research project. This sounds simple. This could indeed be helpful for simplification, but on the other hand, there is the great concern that this will reduce the coverage of what is funded. So that, and if you see this in the combination of national funding, this will put universities under a lot of pressure in terms of financial sustainability. There is another tension between trust and control. This is something is really at the heart of why things are complex. So if we have to provide more trust, we also try to show that universities have a very professional financial management, and that you actually, as a funder, can trust the institutions. And maybe the last tension is the one between standardization and differentiation according to the beneficiaries. So also currently at European level, there's a trend to standardize everything into one system, whereas, and that is obviously challenging for universities that have as the main funder national systems.
Of course, it's always easier to criticize than to come up with solutions. Do you have any recommendations for a simpler and more efficient program?
Yes, we have just recently published a large document where we've worked with our members and see where are really the challenges. And one of the major big steps forward to really simplify these programs would be a greater acceptance of the institutional accounting practices or the national accounting practices. We have several good practices from national funders where they work together with the institutions and say, well, okay, we fund you on that basis, and all institutions can use the same system. So this is for us would be the major step forward. We will also discuss this tomorrow morning in a session where we will exchange also with some funders what experience they have with that.
Do you think there will be higher competition in Europe for scarce resources?
That's indeed one of the concerns, and some of the numbers that you can see here on this slide shows you that one of the challenges is the low success rate of European funding. So they're around, well, between 10 and 15% of projects get funding in European research funding. You also have in the Erasmus Plus for the higher education side, different low success rate in some cases. But that means that almost 90% of projects are not funded. And this is a huge waste of resources if they're not picked up somewhere. So we've tried to calculate this. What are the costs of those project proposals that are not funded? Because in some cases you have to use lots of resources to bring together a consortium and make all of this. So there is almost, even if you sort of have a modest calculation, almost 30% of all the money that's allocated is equivalent to the costs of preparing proposals that are not funded.
Wow. Mm-hmm. Let's move on to the last trend. It's on governance and accountability, an ongoing debate throughout Europe. What's happening in this area?
Yes, this is indeed, as our president has said in the introduction, you can't just talk about funding without looking at what's happening in governance and autonomy. You see here the picture of our university scorecard, one of our flagship products as well, that we have updated last year. And we can see that the debate on governance, on accountability, on autonomy has even intensified in several directions. So this is indeed a strong trend. If I show you maybe two elements that we have seen from this work, we've seen there's a lot of experimentation going on, meaning that in several systems you not only have one governance structure or organizational structure for universities, even if they're the same type, but you would have different frameworks. This is the case in Portugal, where they've been creating foundation universities. They have a different governance structure than the other universities. The same is the case in Estonia, for example, where you have for two flagship universities a different type of governance. And maybe the second important trend is the discussion about the inclusion of external members in the governance of the institutions. This is something we've been monitoring for decades, and I think this is always one of the most heated discussions in any systems, in any reform processes. Who are the external members and how do they get into the university governance? So we have been also consulting in several systems on that, and just take one case in Austria, for example. Very recently, at the beginning of this year, there has been the renewal of the external members. Parts of them are coming from the university, parts of them are selected by the government. There's been a change in the government, and there has been very intense discussions about the question of the independence of these people that come in, if they have the right qualifications. So you can see this is really something at the heart of the question of accountability, of steering, and independence of institutions.
So what is the most frequent governance model in Europe?
Well, you do have basically two types. You have a unitary structure. That means you have only one governing body where you have different representatives in there. And then you have what we call a dual governance structure, where you have one body, usually called a senate or a different name, where you would have the representative, the academic community being also responsible for academic decision makings, and the second body, which is a board-type body, usually a smaller body, who's responsible then for financial and strategic decisions, and etc. So, and this is the model that's becoming more common across Europe, spreading, I would say, from the north of Europe across Europe.
Mm-hmm. Like always. What are ways for public authorities to steer the university sector?
Well, I think from these trends that I've tried to present to you, can see that you have a set of tools. So you have financial steering tools, where you allocate the funding through block grants. You have the possibility of contracts. You have also the question of how you design your governance framework, so the question of how independent you are. So this is basically the mix of tools that are available. And the challenge is always to finding the right balance and the right tools. What we recommend, and this is what we do in all reform processes that we are involved with, trying to really promote that. First of all, you need to look at what you're trying to achieve. What are the aims? So you need to do an analysis of your system, development of student numbers, etc. So what is it that you really need? And then only in the second step, choose the mix of tools that you have available.
So what to make out of all of this?
Well, in the end, it's really, we've been discussing a lot, what are the right tools, what are the right elements to use. We also have to say that recently we have also seen, which is the last point on this slide, threats to university autonomy. So it's not only that we're discussing what are the right ways of using tools, but we also have to increasingly discuss the basic principles and values that we had thought for the university community that we don't need to discuss anymore in that detail in Europe. We have seen various threats towards university autonomy, academic freedom. There have been cases in Turkey, but also what's happening in Hungary, for example, with one of our members also with the Central European University, or just recently the abolishment of gender studies. So all these things are at the table for discussion, and where we also need to be very active in the communication. That it is not only a technical question of how we fund or how we design the governance structure, but really the importance of keeping the independence of universities.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for this very interesting and precise overview. Slido is working, so we are going to Slido now. You can read 2 questions. Okay, you can start. Shall we read out the options? Okay, which of the following trends exposed is most acute for your institution?
The name is
The code?
#funding.
Yeah. Yeah.
If you go to the same website as before and use the #funding.
Okay. I think we try 100 again. Yeah. 100 is good.
100 is good.
Yeah. Yeah, I think. You want to comment on this?
Well, I think it's, I would say it's no surprise to get on the top list insufficient levels of public investment. Sort of followed straight away by doing more with constrained resources. Almost a bit surprising that changing the governance model is only with 14%, because we still have, in a way, we've seen many discussions happening in many systems, but obviously even if this would be
quite some change processes going on.
And quite some change processes, indeed. But maybe it is sort of that the lack of resources is more important than even if you change the governance model. But I think it gives us already a good indication of what are the issues that we want to discuss.
Second question, do you feel your institution is operating more efficiently than 5 years ago?
Okay.
Wow, 85%.
Yes,
that's good.
We know the question.
So maybe applause to
Yes, very well done. Yeah. We sometimes complain about questionnaires that are too suggestive, but but nevertheless, you have 17% to say.
You also have to focus on the things that are better
Yeah.
and are working better.
Yeah, but I think what we can see here is already the awareness that, I mean, we have here respondents that say, yes, we are aware that we're doing things differently than maybe 5 years ago, shows that this is a topic of great awareness and importance to institutions.
So there are also there is some time left to take your questions. Please go ahead. Well, it's the first session. Okay. Do we have a microphone?
The microphone is coming.
Yeah. It's coming.
Lucyna Woźniak, Medical University of Łódź, Poland. I have one comment and one question. Okay, it's better now?
No.
Okay, so I will try as at the university. Lucyna
Okay.
Woźniak, Medical University of Łódź, Poland. One comment and one question. When we were talking about research within ERA, you were talking about research. You haven't even once said innovation. When we are talking about European projects, we are talking about research and innovation. And it is both Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe. So I think this is a very important factor that has to be considered when thinking about funding. And the second question is whether you think that public-private investment can increase efficiency of the university's outtake.
Yes. Well, thank you for that comment. Indeed, it's for us. It's innovation is of course included in that, which will be, I think, a separate question we discuss also tomorrow about the balance within the funding program at Europe. Where is the balance between basic funding and the innovation funding? So thank you very much for that comment. The question about private investment. Well, private investment is certainly a very important factor in finding a balanced and diversified funding structure of institutions. We have to see, though, what are the best ways to include that. I'm just referring to at European level, the European Commission with Commissioner Juncker had one big priority at the beginning, his plan for strategic investment, the EFSI plan, which the aim is to increase private investment. The idea is here to use a sort of guarantee fund to attract more private investment. Now the question is if is this the right way? We've been rather critical about that money from Horizon Europe, Horizon 2020 has been taken away to support this guarantee fund. We thought that is not the right strategy, even if it was said that there will be more private money available to fund research, but what we have seen that this is actually much more funding maybe infrastructure and not really research and innovation activities. So we think it's probably more important to have the right conditions for private investors also to invest in universities, that they think research and innovation is an attractive investment area.
So maybe it also needs more innovative ways of investing and attracting
There
investors.
are indeed. So we will also have a specific session that will look in this innovative ways. I mean, I think it has to be clear as well. It won't replace cuts of public funding in the area of 20%. Yeah? So this is very clear. But we need, all the actors need to work together to, on the one hand, set the right conditions, and also in institutions to have strategy and support mechanisms to look at these sources of funding.
There was a second question over there. Not anymore. Yes, please.
I want wanted to continue in a way this question before I compliment the presentation. I'll get back to that. But when we talk about European funding, the presentation was all about research funding, right? And then we can discuss whether it is research and innovation. But what about European funding for educational activities? And that is not at all unimportant in terms of amounts and in terms of impact and policy consequences. And there is a lot of talk now, as you know, about a new initiative, the European University Networks, and one number that is evoked confidentially or half confidentially is 1.5 billion for the next funding horizon. And that will not be for research, or not primarily for research, or not at all for research. So it is, I think it's an interesting question. How do we account for European funding for educational activities, and what does that do in this context? The second comment, so I should say this is again an impressive presentation, which is based on very serious, thoughtful work. One part that is puzzling me a little bit is that we take 2008 as a reference, or pre-2008, and that is normal. That is, there's no problem methodologically with that, but conceptually it makes me think, why are we taking 2008 as a reference, right? Because it was the end of an era, because that was the golden era, because there is a certain element of, I know, it's not about you and this study, it's not a criticism. We all think about it in that way, as if we wanted to go back. If governments could only restore the amounts from before 2008, and or perhaps, why is it so? Was that the ideal moment in Europe? Is this what we should be aiming for? So again, it's not as an objective moment in time, that's fine, but it's conceptually and policy. What does it mean that we take 2008 or pre-2008 as a reference, and where does that lead in our analysis and perhaps in our recommendation?
Thank you very much. There was a question over there. Yes?
Jan Cieśliński from Poland, University of Białystok. I would like to ask about your opinion about most effective way of distributing fundings for research. Suppose that we have 3 levels: to university, to the rector, to research groups directly by some grants, projects, or intermediate level to research institutes or departments. What do you think about the effectiveness of these 3 ways?
Okay, maybe if I start with the first comments and questions about the education funding. Thank you very much for the comment. Very important one, and I'm glad that it came up because we couldn't pack everything into the presentation. Indeed, we also need to make the case for, at European level, to fund appropriately for education. We've also done a campaign for this, but there's almost a contradiction in a way of everybody, or there's often at European level the talk about European research funding, so you think you will get sufficient funding, but it's actually the pot where if something happens, where money is taken from. With the current proposals for the education program, so the next program following Erasmus+, we're actually quite confident that there is a sufficient amount of funding there, and I'm much more optimistic that this amount of funding will stay there than for the research funding level. So there's a little bit of a contradiction. So indeed, we talk a lot about the research funding, probably more than about the educational funding, but we're more confident at the moment that the educational funding will get a good level at European level. The other question, why did we take 2008 as a starting point, reference point? Very good question. Well, simply We started in 2008 collecting the data with our national rectors conferences in a very simple sort of tour de table way. And at that time, we didn't know that this would become such a sophisticated tool that we would repeat every year the data collection. And I would really recommend to you to look at the online tool where you can actually decide for yourself which reference year you want to have. So you have a slider, you can say 2009 to 2017, so you can do all sorts of combinations. But I think it's a good question that also in our reports we have usually 2 points, so the long-term trends from 2008 until the current year, and then the latest years. So I think it's a good reflection for us to think about that. The last question about the most effective and efficient way to allocate funding. Well, the 3 ways that have been mentioned, and we see different systems that do it in different ways: direct allocation to the institution, to universities, or competitive to researchers or research institutes. Well, we think again, a good mix of funding is important, but the main way of funding should be towards the institution, because the institution at a higher level can then decide which areas they do allocate a block grant funding. So it's also that the contract of competitive funding is usually with the institutions. I mean, we have European funding where it is directly with researchers, so it's the ESC grants. But in general, also at national level, it's best to allocate it at the institution.
I think we come to the end of this first session now. Thank you all for joining. I mean, there will be time to talk to you also later if you have some more questions. And I think it's time for the coffee break, right? Mireia?